Hey everyone, and welcome to your C# tutorial on for loops. As you can see, I have Visual Studio opened up and the boilerplate code ready to go. I've also copied over the previous definition of a loop from our tutorial on while loops. If you'd like, you can pause this video and reread our definition here, or even go back and revisit our tutorial on while loops. But to start off, I'm going to start off by declaring what a for loop is and the syntax around it, and then just the general structure. So it starts off with the for keyword, and then we have an open and closed paren, and then open and closed curly braces for the code block. And so inside of the code block, obviously, this is where your instructions go. And you can put multiple lines of instructions down here. But in here, between the parens, in a while loop, we saw that the while loop just has a Boolean expression that needs to evaluate to true. For a for loop, it's a little bit more complicated, and it's a little bit more defined for the starting and the end point of when the for loop will run. And for that reason, I really like for loops. They're probably my favorite type of loop to use and the one that I use most commonly. So let's begin by defining each part of this for loop. So the first part here is going to be called the initializer. The second part is the condition. Sorry, these should be semicolons here. Semicolon here. And the final part is called the iterator. Okay, cool. So whenever you write a for loop, it's going to look generally like this. We'll fill in the parameters here, but this is the general structure of it. So now let's talk about our parameters. We can begin with the initializer. So an initializer basically just initializes a variable for the condition. So in this case, and in most cases, what we're going to want to do is write an int I equals 0. So this is kind of your standard initializer for a for loop. Generally, for loops will use the letter I as their variable, and they'll generally initialize it to 0, because as we discussed previously in our video, arrays, lists, and other types of data structures start with the index of 0. Next, we have our condition. And so let's define the condition up here. And so the condition must return a Boolean value. The code block, which is this below, the code block will execute only when this condition is true. Cool. So for our condition here, we will say that this will work as long as I is less than 5. So as you can see, the initializer, which was here, it initialized a variable, the variable I, for the condition. The next part, the condition, must return a Boolean value, which we know from our previous video on operators. The less than operator returns a Boolean value. So this is our condition. And as long as I is less than 5, this code will run. So now you might realize, oh, well, I is 0. I will always be less than 5. Well, that's where the iterator comes into play. And so our iterator is basically, it defines what happens after each iteration, an iteration or a loop through the code block. So the iterator defines what happens after each loop through our code through these instructions. So after each loop through these instructions, what we will do is we will do I++. And you remember this plus plus operator from our video on operators. So what this I++ means, if you don't remember, is that it will increment the I variable by 1 every time the code finishes running. So just to recap this really quick, the initializer sets up a variable called I and assigns it to the value 0. The condition says run this loop every time I is less than 5. The iterator says once the code is done running one time, increment that value by 1. So add 1 onto that value every time the code is run. So now all that's left is to replace our comments here with some instructions. So let's do a console write line. And let's print out I. I will be available in this scope. So let's run this code and see what happens. Let's hit play to run the code. And we see that I printed out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and then we finally hit our hello world at the end here. So what's happening is that we created our variable I, it's at 0, and we know that I is less than 5 because it's 0. So this code executes 1 time, and it printed out the number 0 because that's the value of I. Once it was finished printing out 0, we incremented the variable I. So now I has a value of 1. 1 is still less than 5, so this code block executed again. And we printed out 1. After we printed out 1, we incremented I. I was now equal to 2. 2 is less than 5, so we printed out I again. And I was 2. After we printed out the 2, we incremented I. That made I equal to 3. 3 is less than 5, so we printed out I again. You can see it here. After that, we incremented I again. I is now equal to 4. 4 is, of course, less than 5. We printed out 4 again. We incremented I up to 5. Now that's when 5 is not less than 5. 5 is equal to 5. So that stopped our for loop. So once the for loop was finished, it skipped over the code and went down to our console write line of hello world. Okay, so just to recap, a for loop is a loop. A loop is a code structure that executes instructions while a Boolean expression is true. A for loop has an initializer, a condition, and an iterator. The condition returns a Boolean value and allows the code to execute if the Boolean value is true. This Boolean value contains a variable that was initialized in the initializer. After the code runs, the code in the code block runs, we check the iterator to see what happens to our initialized value after the code block. In most situations, you're going to see something like this. You're going to see int I equals 0, I is less than some number, I++. In most for loops, you're going to see something like this. Okay, so that's your basics on for loops in C#. Thanks.